Guardians? Today we're covering 5 Warlock builds that are incredibly strong in episode Heresy. These builds specialize at being the best in specific areas of the game. This could be throwing the deadliest grenades, generating a ton of ammo for your team, or even creating a minion army. Let's jump right on into it. The first build on our list is all about artifact synergy. Glaives have finally gotten some love in this season's artifact, so with this build we're on Prismatic Warlock. That way you can use the class exotic with Spirit of Synthoceps to boost your glaive melee damage by another 100% while surrounded. Ideally you'd have a class exotic with Spirit of Immolate as well for more ability regeneration, but the main thing you need is Synthoceps. Otherwise you can run with Winter's Guile if you don't have a class exotic with Synthoceps. The incredible thing about this build is its pure survivability, with glaives offering you a shield that can block 97.5% of all damage. You can instantly have safety, but we also have numerous ways to heal. With the aspect Feed the Void, we get an enhanced version of Devour, which will fully heal us on kills, but we also bring Facet of Protection. That way, while we're surrounded, we take 15% less damage, and we also bring Facet of Purpose paired with Song of Flame, so that when we pick up orbs, we gain 5 seconds of restoration. This part is a bit overkill, but I like it in the off chance we can't guarantee a kill. And the other huge part of this build is because Synthoceps buffs any melee damage, we can also then bring Lightning Surge. That way we can slide and hit our melee to call down lightning strikes, jolting enemies, and building Bolt Charge for each lightning that hits enemies. Then we pair this with the Arcane Needle so that we can have 3 charges to use. And that's why I also like to bring Facet of Dawn, so that whenever we use our Lightning Surge, we also become Radiant to deal extra weapon damage and pop barrier shields. And what's the flow for this build? Well, you want to start by getting an ability kill to proc your Devour. So I usually like to start with a Lightning Surge to proc Devour and become Radiant. Then you can pull out your glaive and start spamming that melee. If you run into a larger target, make sure to block a little bit of damage to proc our artifact perk and deal even more glaive melee damage. And when it comes to improving the build, for stats I shoot for 100 in resilience. Then I aim for as much discipline and strength as possible, since both are pretty important. As for the weapons, Winterbite is the strongest glaive to bring. However, I really like bringing a special glaive, so I can bring a strong precision weapon as my heavy weapon, like Queenbreaker. You generate a ton of glaive ammo and have a ton of abilities to use, so you can easily run double special weapons if you want to. I always love having a glaive in my primary slot and then bring in an area denial in my second slot. And as for the artifact, Nobel is the most important perk to bring. Now, glaive melee kills will provide ammo to special ammo glaives, and when we block damage with a shield, we gain 85% more glaive melee damage for 6 seconds. We can then bring Hold the Line, so that now while surrounded, we can get kills to provide a bump of health and extra reload speed when using our glaive. After that, we want to bring perks that match our other weapons. For fusion rifles, make sure to bring Particle Reconstruction, and if you plan on bringing void weapons, Volatile Marksman and Maligned Harvest are both really strong. And where does this build excel? Well, this build is honestly just so much fun to use. In most cases, you can spam those melees, but if you do have a ton of Exploder units, swap to your other weapons and chuck those grenades. And because of that, this build will be strong in nearly any content that you do, no matter if it's easy or hard content. The next build on the list has quickly become one of my favorite Warlock builds. Hopping over to Arc Warlock, we're bringing the exotic legs Geomag Stabilizers. With this exotic, the Chaos Reach super will refund itself while dealing damage, capping out at just over double the duration. And the other huge part of this exotic is that Ionic Traces now grant 7% Chaos Reach energy. With this in mind, we aim to create as many Ionic Traces as possible. And one of the main ways we generate Ionic Traces comes from the aspect Electrostatic Mind. Now, killing enemies with Arc abilities or enemies affected by an Arc debuff will generate an Ionic Trace. I then double up and bring Spark of Ions, so that every 10 seconds we can kill a jolted target or get a kill with Bolt Charge and create another Ionic Trace. But it doesn't stop there. We then bring Spark of Discharge, so that arc weapon kills will progress towards creating another Ionic Trace. This also makes it so that collecting Ionic Traces will grant you another stack of Bolt Charge. Now, basically anything we do will create an Ionic Trace, if not multiple. That leads to a ton of super energy, but we want to capitalize on this even further. So we bring Spark of Frequency. That way, every time we collect Ionic Trace, we now get 2 stacks of Bolt Charge instead of 1. To top it all off, we bring the exotic fusion Delicate Tomb. With this fusion, every time we collect an Ionic Trace, the next shot will deal double damage and jolt an enemy, meaning that we'll not only deal a ton of burst damage, but we can also create up to 4 Ionic Traces from 1 kill, since Delicate Tomb also has an intrinsic chance to create an Ionic Trace. And what's the flow for this build? Well, the incredible thing about this build is it's incredibly easy to get going. Throw a grenade or a melee to get a kill and spawn your first Ionic Trace. After collecting it, you're now amplified amplified for even more damage with your melee, and your Delicate Tomb will be loaded with Tempest Cascade, which in turn will create another Ionic Trace. Each of these Ionic Traces will give back a ton of ability energy, a ton of super energy, power up your Delicate Tomb, and give stacks of Bolt Charge. All of this will build up your Chaos Reach at an insanely rapid rate, meaning you can use it to freely wipe out a ton of enemies, take down a mini boss, or even deal some decent boss DPS. I had plenty of times where in between DPS phases I would get another Chaos Reach to basically only melt the boss with our super. And when it comes to improving the build, for stats I shoot for 100 in resilience, then I aim for as much discipline as possible while keeping a decently high amount of recovery. For weapons, while it's not necessary to bring Delicate Tomb, I do think it's the best option for dealing a ton of damage and creating those Ionic Traces. Feel free to bring your favorite primary and heavy weapons since they aren't super important for this build. And for the artifact, the main perk you want to bring is Flashover, amping up your Bolt Charge damage by another 150%. Defibrillating Blast is also really strong. That way, every time you unleash your Bolt Charge, you get a bump of health. And Photonic Flare is also really strong, since killing with arc damage on enemies that are jolted will cause a blinding burst. But of course, we want to bring Dielectric. That way, killing an arc debuff enemy will grant more Bolt Charge. This build is so much fun to use. Spam that super whenever you want to, because all of those Ionic Traces feed back a ton of Chaos Reach energy. You have to make sure to give this build a shot before this season ends. And before we get to the next build, if you're enjoying the video, head down and hit that like button or subscribe. It would mean the world to me. Alright, let's get back to the video. And this next build is all about powering up your grenade as much as possible. With this season, Verity's Brow and Spirit of Verity got a big buff. Now, when you get kills to work up your stacks of Death Throws, the stacks will slowly decay over time. And since we'll be on Prismatic Warlock, I highly recommend a class exotic with Spirit of Verity. That way you can bring another exotic perk like Spirit of Immos Light or Apotheosis. Now, it is worth mentioning that the grenade recharge you get from Spirit of Verity is only half of that of Verity's Brow. However, the damage still caps out at 100%, so it's definitely still worth running it on the class exotic. Now, I really wanted to use the Storm Grenade so that I can pair into Arc and Bolt Charge. However, the Vortex Grenade ended up feeling better overall. With Artifact Synergy, you can easily apply Volatile and Weaken to enemies when using a Void primary weapon. And since this build will be about dealing a ton of Void damage from your weapons and grenade, I decided to bring Facet of Sacrifice. That way, when we have a light buff like Devour, ability kills will give us extra Darkness Transcendent energy, so that we can transcend more often. I then brought the Arcane Needle to help spread Unravel on enemies. That way, I can bring Facet of Courage to increase our grenade and light-based damage by another 10% on enemies affected by a Darkness debuff, so that we can power up our grenade even more. And what's the flow for this build? Well, I love to bring a Void primary with Repulsor Brace. That way, we can proc volatile rounds by getting rapid precision hits and constantly gaining Overshield in the process. In the meantime, while killing with your Void primary, you'll be working up stacks of Death Throws to increase your grenade damage. And since Devour will be feeding back a ton of grenade energy, you want to make sure to constantly chuck those grenades. If you come across a boss or a mini boss, I like to score a few kills with my primary weapon to make sure I have 3 to 5 stacks of Death Throws. Then I use a powered melee to unravel them, and then you can chuck that grenade to deal a ton of damage. When it comes to improving the build, for stats I shoot for 100 in resilience and discipline. Then I like to go for as much strength as possible. As for the weapons, as we mentioned, a Void primary with Repulsor Brace is my go-to. You have free reign when it comes to your other weapons, though I love bringing a machine gun like Hammerhead so that I can quickly build up my Death Throw stacks, and for its artifact synergy. And for the artifact, Volatile Marksman is huge for this build. Now, rapid precision hits with your Void weapons will grant them volatile rounds, making it really easy to proc Repulsor Brace and deal more damage. And while it's boosted, Volatile Explosions will give back more class ability energy, which in turn means more Solar Buddies. But Maligned Harvest is also really strong, making it so that after rapidly inflicting Volatile, your next Void damage will cause a weakening effect, giving you another way to proc Repulsor Brace and to weaken bosses during DPS phases. And if you are bringing a machine gun, then Hold the Line and Heavy Ordnance are also really strong. I absolutely love the rework that Verity's Brow got. While this build isn't the most meta, it is a ton of fun to use, and it offers you a different playstyle to most Prismatic Warlock builds. And the next build on the list is all about those team-based activities. In really hard content, having a ton of heavy ammo means more survivability for you and your team, since you can melt through enemies. That's why for this build, we're bringing the exotic helmet, Cenotaph Mask. The main thing that this does is now when you score 5 hits on a mini boss, champion, champion, vehicle, or boss, it marks them for 10 seconds. Then when an ally kills that marked target, it spawns heavy ammo bricks for your team and a special ammo brick for you. While this special brick does help you keep up your ammo for your trace rifle, this season we got the first of its kind Lodestar. This arc trace rifle uses primary ammo. That way you can bring a really strong special weapon, and you can use it more freely since you'll have those special ammo bricks dropping. While Lodestar isn't 100% necessary, I really think it opens up this build to use any special and heavy you want, making it a little bit more viable. And since this build is all about endgame activities, I made sure to amp up its damage and give it ways to intrinsically stun champions. We bring Facet of Courage so that we can use our Arcane Needle to unravel enemies, proccing 10% more damage for all of our other abilities. Then we bring Facet of Dominance so that all of our grenades will weaken enemies, making them take even more damage. And top it all off with Facet of Dawn to easily become Radiant for more weapon damage and to stun those barrier champions. Remember, your prismatic grenades will stun both Overload and Unstoppable champions, since it will slow and eventually freeze enemies. And what's the flow for this build? Well, like with most other prismatic Warlock builds, you want to get an ability kill to start off. That way you can proc Devour for more health and grenade energy on kills. Then simply use your abilities and Lodestar to wipe out most enemies. Remember, Cenotaph constantly reloads trace rifles, so Lodestar will quickly build up its alternate fire, which allows you to jolt enemies when firing from the hip, and that pairs perfectly with our later artifact perks. And when it comes to improving the build, for stats I shoot for 100 in Resilience and Discipline. Then I go for a mix of Strength and Recovery. As for weapons, Lodestar is the best option for me. That way I can bring a strong special weapon like Scatter Signal, which can be boosted with the artifact, and we can use it more often since we will be spawning those special ammo bricks. However, you could also opt for a strong primary weapon like Outbreak and then bring a special trace rifle like Chronophage, which can get Repulsor Brace and destabilizing rounds. And for the artifact, since Lodestar can easily jolt enemies with its alternate fire mode, I love to bring Photonic Flare. That way, killing exhausted or severed targets with arc damage will create a blinding burst. And in case you didn't know, jolting enemies counts as exhausting them, so you'll constantly be causing these blinding bursts. I then also like to bring Dielectric. That way, killing these arc debuffed enemies will also give a stack of Bolt Charge. Again, easy to do since we can jolt everything with Lodestar. Top it off with Flashover and Defibrillating Blast. That way, Bolt Charge deals more damage, heals you, and jolts enemies. This build is perfect for really hard content like Grandmaster Nightfalls, or even dungeon and raid scenarios where you might just need some extra heavy ammo. Just make sure to let your teammates know that you need to mark those mini bosses before they melt them. And before we get to our last build on the list, I do have one bonus build that is really strong. Speaker Sight is still one of the best builds in raid and dungeon environments, though I have talked about it too many times to give it its own spot on this specific list. For the last build, I saw that we were getting Horde Shuttle back and immediately knew what build I wanted to include on this list. This build is my Threadling Army build. It's goofy, it's fun, and it's actually really strong. For this build, I landed back on Strand for one simple reason: Thread of Evolution. And this makes it so that Threadlings will deal 33% more damage. So if I planned on creating as many Threadlings as possible, why not make them deal more damage? So for the exotic, I went with Swarmers. That way, every time we destroy a Tangle, we create 2 more Threadlings. Threadlings will now also unravel enemies, but that isn't a huge part of this build. To further take advantage of Tangles, I also wanted to bring the Wanderer. Now, Tangles will cause a suspending burst when destroyed. This helps with ad control and stunning those unstoppable champs. And one major component of this build is that we want to bring a Strand primary weapon, and that's because of 2 reasons. First, Thread of Rebirth, which will make it so that every 3rd kill on minor enemies with a Strand weapon will spawn a Threadling. And second, we want to bring Unraveling Orbs from the season's artifact. That way, picking up an orb or a Tangle will give our Strand weapons unraveling rounds. This will already create a ton of Threadlings, but we bring 2 more things to compound on this even more. First, for our grenade, we bring the Threadling Grenade to create 3 Threadlings instantly, and we pair that with Thread of Generation so that we get more grenade energy back by causing damage. And second, we bring Weaver's Call so that using our Rift will create 3 more Threadlings, and it'll deploy all perch Threadlings. But this also secretly makes it so that every 3rd kill from Strand damage will create another perch Threadling. So it sounds like a lot, and it kind of is, but in play, it's stupidly simple. Use your abilities and Strand weapons. Basically, anything that you do will create Threadlings in some way, shape, or form. I love to grab those tangles and throw them at mini bosses or a group of enemies to suspend them, making them easier to kill. Then you can pop your rift or throw a grenade to instantly deal a ton of damage from your threadlings. For stats, I shoot for 100 in resilience. Then I aim for as much discipline as possible while keeping at least 50 to 60 recovery. That way we can pop our rift more often and easily deploy those perch threadlings. And when it comes to weapons, I was having a ton of fun with the brand new Barrow Dyad to melt through enemies. But any legendary weapon with hatchling is also a good option. And in hard content, I'd also recommend the new Adamantite, which is a strand support frame auto rifle to offer you another way to heal. And for that artifact, as we mentioned, we want to bring unraveling orbs. That way we can easily unravel enemies, which pairs perfectly with Horde Shuttle, so that dealing damage to unraveled enemies will create even more threadlings. Otherwise, any artifact perks that match your weapons are your best bet. I just can't get over how funny it is to pop a healing rift and see 8 threadlings come flying out. This build is so goofy, and its pure ad clearing potential is actually a bit ludicrous. And there you have it, Guardians. We've covered builds that are goofy, creating a ton of minions, builds that make the most out of the artifact, and even builds that help out your team. But if you want to see 5 Titan builds for episode Heresy, then go check out this video here. Remember, mastering these builds is only the beginning. Experiment with different combinations and tweak your loadouts to suit your playstyles. If you found this video helpful or just enjoyed seeing a new perspective, feel free to like the video and comment down below on what builds you've been enjoying most for Warlocks. Keep an eye out for future videos as we continue to explore the ever-evolving world of Destiny 2. Until then, may the threads of fate be ever in your favor. This is Lucky Mech signing off. See you on the next adventure, Guardians.